A geologist vanished from the Nevada desert in 1998, leaving a campsite so perfect it was like he was erased from the world. For 24 years, the case was silent. Then, a drone found his body in a hidden cave. The police called it a cult suicide and closed the case. But the official story is a lie, a cover-up for a toxic secret the government is still killing to protect. Stay with me. Some places on the map are not destinations. They are endings. Solitude Canyon, Nevada, was one of them. The fog of memory settles thick over these landscapes, blurring the line between what happened and the stories we tell ourselves afterward. In the summer of 1998, this place, already a ghost, became the final chapter for Dr. Aris Thorne. He was a geologist, a man who believed the Earth held no secrets, only a very long memory. The irony is a knife that never dulls. The canyon had died twice before Aris. First, when the silver vein ran dry in the 1950s, leaving the skeletal remains of a town whose bones were picked clean by the wind. Then it died a second, slower death, as the silence of the high desert crept in, a patient force working to reclaim what men had briefly borrowed. It was a place built for disappearance, and it performed its function with terrifying precision. Dr. Thorne was not a man of ambiguity. At 32, his world was one of data, of logic, of the crystalline certainty of mineral structures. He moved through life with the meticulous precision of a scientist plotting a graph. He had come to this forgotten corner of Nevada not for silver, but to chase a dissonant hum in the data, a ghost in the machine of the Earth. The official geological surveys of the area were simple, clean, but the groundwater contamination reports he'd uncovered, the anomalous seismic readings, they told a different story. They were a whisper of something wrong, something hidden deep beneath the rock and the official narrative. His purpose here was singular: to make the story and the data align. He was driven by an insatiable need for the truth, a need that would ultimately lead him into a silence from which he would never return. His last known human contact was a satellite phone call to his sister, Lena. She was a librarian in Denver, a woman who lived in the ordered world of established facts and quiet study. Their calls were a familiar ritual. He was the field scientist, his voice crackling with the energy of discovery, painting pictures of rock strata and strange magnetic fields. She was his calm anchor, grounding his geological poetry in human terms. "It's weird," Lena had said, the thrill of a puzzle sharpening his voice. "The contamination profile, it's not silver, it's not lead. It's something exotic, something I've never seen. And the ground hums here. You can feel it through the soles of your boots." Lena had smiled then, picturing him there, a lone figure against the vast, indifferent canvas of the desert. "Just don't fall down any old mine shafts, little brother," she'd teased, the casual warning of a loving sister. "The world has enough ghosts." "The Earth keeps no secrets," Len had replied, the words a statement of his core philosophy, a belief that would soon be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. It just has a very long memory. That was the last time she, or anyone, would hear his voice. When he failed to make his scheduled check-in 3 days later, the search began. What they found was not a scene of tragedy, but a vacuum, a void where a man should have been. His truck was found parked neatly at the edge of the canyon, locked, a silent sentinel. His campsite was immaculate. His expensive surveying equipment laid out on a tarp with geometric precision, as if waiting for his return. His tent was empty, the sleeping bag still rolled. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks leading away, no evidence of an animal attack. No scream, no sound, no witness. Just gone. Dr. Aris Thorne had been erased. Solitude Canyon, a place named for its loneliness, had swallowed him whole, and the silence that followed was absolute. The initial search was a study in futility, a small human effort swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape of the canyon. For 3 days, the local sheriff's department, based out of the nearest county seat, a small, dusty town called Covenant, combed the area. They were led by a young, earnest deputy named Marcus Vance, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the mystery in the lines around his eyes. He walked Lena through the scene himself, his gestures slow, his expression a mask of weary confusion. "It's like he was lifted right out of here," Vance said, his voice low, as if not to disturb the perfect stillness of the campsite. "We've seen people get lost. We've seen accidents. I've never seen nothing." His words hung in the dry air, a perfect summary of the void they faced. The effort was thorough, even desperate. Search and rescue teams, their ropes disappearing into the black maws of the old mine shafts, rappelled into the earth's darkness. Their headlamps illuminated only rock, dust, and the skeletal remains of forgotten mining equipment from a half-century before. They found no trace of a man who had been there just days ago. Cadaver dogs, with their uncanny ability to read the stories left behind in the soil, were brought in. They grew frantic at the edge of the campsite, whining and circling, their powerful senses overwhelmed by a puzzle they couldn't solve. They could find no scent trail leading away from the tent, no path to follow into the sagebrush or towards the canyon rim. It was as if Aris had not walked away, but had simply dissolved into the thin, heated air. The official investigation, faced with a complete absence of evidence, quickly ran out of momentum. In the face of such a perfect void, theories become simple, comforting things. The prevailing one, unspoken but heavily implied in the official reports, was that Dr. Thorne, an outsider unaccustomed to the desert's treachery, had wandered off, that he had fallen into one of the countless unmapped fissures or collapsed tunnels that riddled the landscape like wounds, his body lost forever in the labyrinthine darkness beneath the canyon. It was a simple, tragic explanation. It was a story that required no further action, no more resources, no deeper questions. Within weeks, the active search was formally called off. The case file, thin and heavy with unanswered questions, was placed in a steel cabinet in Covenant. It remained officially open, but it was practically forgotten, a piece of sad local history. For Lena Thorne, this quiet, logical conclusion was an agony. It was a profound betrayal of the brother she knew. Aris was not a careless man. He was a scientist who understood and respected the awesome power of the natural world more than anyone she had ever met. The scene at the campsite did not speak of a tragic accident. It spoke of a removal, an extraction so clean, so efficient, it was terrifying in its perfection. But with no proof, her theories were dismissed as the grief-stricken ramblings of a sister who could not accept the unacceptable. The world moved on. The news cycle forgot his name. For Lena, the cold years were just beginning. The silence from Solitude Canyon became the defining sound of her life, a constant, humming void where her brother used to be. The years that followed were a long, slow erosion. Hope is a fragile thing, and in the face of absolute silence, it calcifies, turning into something harder, more patient. Lena Thorne, the pragmatic librarian from Denver, became an archivist of a single, devastating event. Her small, quiet apartment, once a sanctuary of literature, transformed into a private incident room, a shrine to a question that had no answer. One entire wall was covered in topographical maps of Solitude Canyon, the paper crisscrossed with the faded lines of the search grids from 1998. Bookshelves that once held literary classics now groaned under the weight of meticulously organized binders. They were filled with police reports, geological surveys, and every newspaper article, no matter how small, ever written about her brother's disappearance. She became fluent in the sterile, heartbreaking language of cold cases, of forensics, of probability, and non-familiar abduction. She was no longer just a sister. She was the sole keeper of her brother's memory, a relentless seeker in a world that had long since stopped looking. Every year, on the anniversary of his last call, she would dial the number for the Covenant County Sheriff's Department. The calls became a grim ritual, a single point of contact with the official world that had failed her. Deputy Vance, who eventually became Sheriff Vance, was always patient, always respectful. His voice, year after year, carried the same note of tired sympathy. "Nothing new to report, Lena," he would say. "We keep the file active. If anything ever turns up." But nothing ever did. He became her only living link to the case, a voice of official continuity in the crushing 24-year silence. Her life became a quiet vigil. She learned to live with the phantom limb of her loss, the constant, dull ache of the unknown that sat behind her ribs. Her friends, those who remained, watched her with a mixture of pity and awe. She was not frantic. She was methodical, patient, like a geologist waiting for a mountain to shift. She held on to his final words, his core belief. The earth keeps no secrets forever. She just had to wait for it to speak. For 24 years she waited. She listened to the silence, poring over the maps and the reports, searching for a single discordant note she might have missed. It was a quiet, stubborn act of defiance. The world might forget the name Aris Thorne, might relegate him to a footnote in the strange history of the Nevada desert, but she would not. She would hold his name like a flame in the dark, refusing to let the void that had taken him have the final word. The breakthrough, when it finally came after 24 years of silence, arrived not with a shout, but with the digital whisper of a drone's rotors. The earth gives back what it takes, but sometimes it needs a new kind of eye to see it. In the spring of 2023, a pair of urban explorers from Las Vegas, drawn by the modern folklore of the Solitude Canyon ghost town, decided to get a new perspective. They were hobbyists, not detectives, looking for cinematic shots of decaying buildings to post online, not for evidence in a decades-old cold case. They sent their drone high above the canyon, then deep into its less accessible chasms. A recent rock slide, likely triggered by a minor winter tremor, had changed the landscape. A section of a sheer cliff face had sheared away, exposing a dark opening, a wound in the stone that was not on any map. Curiosity, that most human of engines, took over. The drone operator, sitting a half-mile away, piloted the small machine into the darkness. The video feed, transmitted back to his handheld controller, was grainy and indistinct at first, a blur of gray and black. Then, deep within the cavern, the drone's powerful LED light caught something that did not belong. A glint of metal. Something artificial, something manufactured, half buried in rubble and dust. He maneuvered the drone closer, the small rotors stirring up ancient dust. Zooming in, the shape became clearer. It was the edge of a makeshift metal door, rusted and bent, set into the natural rock formation. Thinking they'd stumbled upon a hidden prepper bunker or an old miner's secret stash, they finished their filming and, a few days later, posted the footage online. The video, titled "Secret Cave in Nevada Ghost Town," bounced around the niche forums of urban exploration for a week, a minor curiosity. But the internet has a long memory, too. A retired journalist, a man who had briefly covered Aris Thorne's disappearance back in 1998, saw the video and recognized the jagged silhouette of the canyon. The forgotten name surfaced from the depths of his memory. He made a phone call. He called the Covenant County Sheriff's Department. The news hit Lena like a physical blow. After 24 years of silence, there was finally a sound, a new lead, a new location to mark on her maps. Hope, an emotion she had carefully packed away like a fragile, dangerous heirloom, surged through her with a terrifying intensity. She booked the first flight to Nevada, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Sheriff Marcus Vance met her at the small county airport. He was older now, his face lined with the cares of his office, but his eyes held the same sympathetic gravity she remembered so well. "We're going in, Lena," he told her, his voice steady, a rock in her sea of turmoil. "Whatever's in there, we're going to find it. I promise you. This time, we'll get you an answer." For the first time in over 2 decades, Lena Thorne allowed herself to believe that the long, silent winter was finally, truly over. The investigation of the newly discovered cavern became a major operation for Covenant County, a sudden flurry of activity in a place that had been dormant for decades. Sheriff Vance, his face a mask of grim determination, treated the site with the gravity of a tomb. He personally supervised the team of deputies and forensic specialists, his presence a constant, calming force against the rising tide of speculation. The entrance to the cavern was unstable, a jagged mouth of fractured rock. Before anyone could enter, geological experts had to be brought in to secure it, their drills echoing strangely across the silent canyon. Lena waited at a command post set up a half-mile away, a small cluster of vehicles against the vast, empty backdrop of the desert. The heat rising from the asphalt was a pale imitation of the fire in her nerves. She sat in the back of a police SUV, the door open, listening to the crackle of the radio. Every burst of static, Every distant, indistinct shout was a potential answer, a potential end to her 24-year vigil. When the team finally breached the cavern, the reports that came back over the radio were strange, unsettling, and painted a picture of something far more complex than a simple disappearance. The cavern was a natural formation, a hollow space carved by ancient water, but it had been modified. The makeshift metal door led into a larger chamber, where they found what could only be described as a primitive, long-term living space. There were decaying sleeping bags, stacks of canned goods with expiration dates from the late 1990s, and shelves crudely carved into the rock walls. On the far wall, painted in what looked like ochre and charcoal, were bizarre, swirling symbols that resembled no known language. Then came the discovery that made the radio fall silent for a full, heart-stopping minute. In the center of the chamber, arranged in a deliberate circle, were skeletal remains. The forensics team on site quickly identified 3 individuals. And near the remains, they found more artifacts. Several leather-bound journals, strange wooden totems carved with the same symbols from the wall, and a rusted metal box. The scene wasn't one of a tragic accident or a simple hiding place. It was ritualistic. It was a shrine. It was a tomb. Sheriff Vance's voice, when he finally came back on the radio to his command post, was heavy, measured, and directed at no one and everyone. "We've found them," he said, the words cutting through the static. "And we've found a story." The forensics team worked for 2 days, their white-suited figures moving like ghosts in the darkness of the cavern, meticulously documenting and removing every item. They recovered personal effects, fragments of clothing, and the journals. One set of remains, based on preliminary dental records and the presence of a titanium pin in the femur from a long-heeled college skiing accident, was tentatively identified as Dr. Aris Thorne. Lena's vigil was over. The not knowing, that endless torture of the imagination, was finally over. But as the strange, whispered details from the cavern emerged, a new, colder dread began to settle in her heart. The answer she was about to receive was not the one she had ever, in her wildest nightmares, imagined. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Marcus Vance stood before a crowd of regional news cameras and delivered the official story. He stood at a podium set up in front of the Covenant County Courthouse, the desert sun glinting off the microphone. He spoke with a somber confidence, the very picture of a man who had finally brought closure to a painful, lingering mystery. The story he told was both shocking and, in a strange, terrible way, simple. Dr. Aris Thorne, he explained to the cameras and to the world, had not been the victim of an accident or foul play. He had been a secret member of a small, esoteric doomsday cult. They called themselves the Children of Tellus. Vance held up one of the leather-bound journals recovered from the cavern, its cover cracked with age for the cameras to see. "These journals," he said, his voice resonating with a calm authority, "painstakingly detail Dr. Thorne's descent into paranoia and delusion. He believed, based on his own misinterpretation of geological data, that the world was on the brink of a geological cataclysm. He believed that Solitude Canyon was a sacred place, a womb that would protect the chosen few from the coming apocalypse. The other remains found in the cavern, Vance continued, belonged to his two followers, individuals who had cut all ties with society to join him in his paranoid quest. Their disappearance, he explained, was intentional. They had sealed themselves inside the cavern to await the end of the world. And when it didn't come, they had, according to the final, desperate entries in the journals, succumbed to a ritualistic suicide pact. The evidence, as Vance presented it, was overwhelming and self-contained. The strange symbols on the walls matched esoteric diagrams found throughout the journals. The journals themselves were filled with rambling, prophetic prose that twisted geological terminology into a bizarre new scripture. The media devoured the story. It was a perfect, self-contained tragedy, a story custom-made for headlines. A brilliant mind lost to madness, a bizarre cult in the desolate heart of the American desert. Dr. Aris Thorne was no longer a missing person, a question mark on a map. He was a tragic, cautionary figure, a new piece of dark folklore for Solitude Canyon. The case of the vanishing geologist was officially and finally closed. Lena watched the press conference on the small television in her motel room, the shifting colors of the screen painting the walls. The world was being given an answer, a neat and tidy narrative tied with a perfect bow. But Lena felt a profound sense of wrongness, a dissonance that vibrated deep in her bones. The man on the screen, the hero sheriff who had solved a 24-year-old mystery, was describing a stranger. The Aris she knew, the man of logic, of data, of unflinching scientific reason, would never have abandoned it for faith and fear. The story was perfect. It was seamless. It answered every question. And Lena knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that it was a lie. A week after the press conference, a cardboard box arrived at Lena's apartment in Denver. It was from the Covenant County Sheriff's Department. Inside were the personal effects recovered from the cavern that had been officially deemed to belong to Aris. Among the few preserved items was one of the leather-bound cult journals. Lena received the box with trembling hands. It felt heavy, not with the physical weight of its contents, but with the weight of the story it contained. It felt like holding a piece of a nightmare, a tangible piece of the fiction that had erased her brother. For days, she couldn't bring herself to open it. It sat on her dining room table, a silent, malevolent presence. When she finally found the courage, she sat in her quiet library, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the screaming in her head. She opened the journal. She began to read, and at first the words were just a blur of pain, a catalogue of madness attributed to the brother she loved. But Lena was a librarian. She was a woman trained to see patterns, to notice details, to understand the structure and voice of a text. And the details were wrong. The handwriting was a close, careful imitation of Aris' chaotic scrawl, but it was too uniform, too controlled. Aris' handwriting had always been a frantic dance on the page, the letters growing larger and more impassioned when he was excited by an idea. This was the work of a student copying a lesson, not the urgent outpouring of a man on the edge. It was a forgery. The first real crack in the official story appeared on page 37. The journal described a metamorphic transfiguration of the soul, a clumsy attempt to use a geological metaphor for spiritual change. Aris had loved geological metaphors. They were the poetry of his scientific mind. But the journal entry used the term metamorphica, a word describing change through intense heat and pressure, to describe a process of slow, cold, sedimentary layering. It was a fundamental, almost comical error. It was like a professional chef confusing the concepts of sautéing and boiling. Aris, who could spend an hour explaining the critical difference between schist and gneiss, would never, ever have made that mistake. It was a single, jarringly false note in an otherwise perfectly composed symphony of deception. This was her totem of memory, not a physical object like a bracelet or a boot, but the indelible, unforgeable imprint of her brother's mind. The forger had replicated his interests. They had replicated his handwriting, but they could not replicate his knowledge. They had written a story about a geologist, but they didn't understand geology. The journal was not a confession. It was a script. It was a carefully manufactured piece of fiction designed to be found, designed to provide a simple, believable ending. And if the journal was a lie, then the entire story, the cult, the suicide, the neat and tidy closure provided by Sheriff Vance was a lie as well. The case wasn't closed. It had just been buried under a new, deeper layer of earth. That single false note in the forged journal sent Lena back to her own archives. The 24 years of research she had so painstakingly compiled. She pulled out the dusty boxes containing Aris's original research notes, the real ones, the ones he had sent to her for safekeeping just before his final trip to Nevada. For years, she had looked at them as relics, as sacred artifacts of the man he was. Now, for the first time, she looked at them as a map to the truth. She spread the papers across the large, scarred oak table in her library, the scent of old paper and ink filling the quiet air. Dust floated in the beams of morning light like snow caught in a photograph. Here were his initial reports on the groundwater contamination, pages filled with complex chemical notations and diagrams she had never fully understood. Here were the printouts of the seismic readings from Solitude Canyon, jagged lines that looked like the frantic heartbeat of a buried thing. Before, she had seen all this as the abstract scientific work that had, for some unknown reason, led him to that fatal place. Now, she saw it as the reason he was killed. Armed with a new, terrifying hypothesis, Lena began to work. She was no longer just grieving. She was investigating. She spent weeks referencing the strange chemical compounds Aris had noted in his margins with industrial and military databases. Most were unidentifiable, their signatures unique. But a few matched the profiles of rare, highly toxic byproducts associated with experimental metallurgical processes and advanced radiological shielding. They were chemicals that had absolutely no connection to silver mining. They were the fingerprints of a far more modern and far more dangerous industry. The seismic data was even more damning. The hum that Aris had felt, the vibration had mentioned in his last call, was not a natural geological phenomenon. When she fed the raw data into an analysis program, a clear pattern emerged. It was a low-frequency, rhythmic vibration, consistent with heavy, deep earth machinery operating on a continuous 24-hour cycle. The picture that slowly emerged from the dust of her brother's archives was dark and chilling. Someone had been operating a secret industrial-scale facility deep beneath Solitude Canyon, something that produced incredibly exotic and toxic waste. Aris hadn't stumbled into a doomsday cult living in a cave. He had stumbled upon a massive, ongoing cover-up. His scientific instruments were not tools for finding spiritual enlightenment. They were tools that had detected a modern, industrial monster hiding in the shadows of a ghost town. He hadn't been lost to madness. He had been silenced because he was sane, because he trusted his data, and because that data was leading him to a truth that someone was willing to kill to protect. Lena's investigation became a deep dive into the labyrinth of corporate shells and declassified government contracts, a world hidden in plain sight. She was a librarian, and she wielded information like a weapon. She spent her nights navigating obscure online databases, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and meticulously tracing the ownership history of the land around Solitude Canyon. The official records showed it was public land, owned by the Bureau of Land Management. But a single, almost invisible footnote in a 1970s environmental impact statement led her to a private leasing agreement, an agreement with a company she had never heard of. Ethelred Logistics. On the surface, Ethelred was a mundane shipping and storage company with a bland corporate profile. But as Lena peeled back the layers of shell corporations and holding companies, she found its true identity. It was a ghost, a primary contractor for the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy for over 50 years. Its specialty was listed in dry, bureaucratic language: classified material disposal and long-term sequestration. It was a company that made things disappear. Her blood ran cold. She kept digging, her search becoming a frantic, obsessive quest through the digital archives of the Cold War. She found a heavily redacted congressional report from the 1980s that mentioned a program called Project Chimera. It was a top-secret initiative to develop and, more importantly, dispose of experimental weapons components, a toxic cocktail of chemical, biological, and radiological agents that were too unstable and too dangerous to be acknowledged. The project was officially terminated in the early 90s, but the waste, the literal poison of a secret war, had to go somewhere. One of the proposed disposal methods was deep earth injection in geologically stable, remote, arid locations. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with the sickening force of a tectonic shift. Solitude Canyon wasn't a silver mine. It was a tomb. Ethelred Logistics, the ghost company, had turned it into a clandestine, illegal dump site for the country's most dangerous and unspeakable secrets. The contamination Aris had found in the groundwater, the unnatural rhythmic humming he had felt through the soles of his boots, it was all evidence of this active, ongoing operation. He hadn't discovered a doomsday cult. He had discovered a multi-billion-dollar environmental crime. A secret so toxic it could rewrite the history of the Cold War. He had to be silenced. And Ethelred Logistics, a company that specialized in making problems and people disappear, had simply performed its function. The cult was just the headstone they'd placed on his empty, unmarked grave. With the name Ethelred Logistics burning in her mind like a brand, Lena knew she had to confront the one person who connected the past to the present, the man who was the public face of the lie, Sheriff Marcus Vance. She flew back to Nevada, but this time she was not fueled by hope. She was propelled by a cold, hard certainty. She didn't call ahead. She didn't make an appointment. She walked into the Covenant County Sheriff's Station, the bell on the door jangling in the quiet, and asked to see him. She found him in his office. The walls were adorned with civic awards and a framed newspaper clipping from 2 weeks prior, the headline celebrating his masterful solving of the 24-year-old Thorne case. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that was quickly replaced by his familiar, weary sympathy. But Lena was done with his sympathy. She didn't say hello. She walked to his desk and placed a single sheet of paper on the blotter in front of him. It was a printout of the 1970s land leasing agreement between the Bureau of Land Management and Ethelred Logistics for the parcel of land that included Solitude Canyon. Vance looked down at the paper, then up at Lena. For a long moment, the friendly, concerned mask of the small-town sheriff held. Then, slowly, it crumbled. The weariness in his eyes was not from overwork. It was the ancient exhaustion of a man who had carried a heavy, corrosive secret for a very long time. "You should have left it alone, Lena," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a sigh of defeat. "You should have just taken the story and been at peace." The truth, when it came out, was not a rush of confession, but a slow, defeated unraveling of a compromised life. Back in 1998, it was Deputy Vance who had been the first on the scene, the first to find Aris's immaculate, empty campsite. He'd reported it, and within hours, 2 men in dark, identical suits had arrived from Reno. They weren't FBI. They weren't from any state agency. They were from Ethelred. They took him aside, and they told him, with a calm, bureaucratic finality, what was going to happen. They told him the official story would be an accident, a disappearance into the unforgiving desert. They told him his cooperation would ensure a long and prosperous career in law enforcement. They also made it very clear what his refusal would ensure. He was a young deputy with a new family, a mortgage, living in a small town with no other opportunities. He made a bargain. He confirmed everything Lena had suspected. Aris had been captured by Ethelred's private security team after his scientific instruments started taking readings too close to their hidden deep earth injection site. They killed him. The cult narrative was a contingency plan, a fiction packet Ethelred had on standby for any security breach. The bodies in the cavern were John Doe's, drifters from their corporate security files, their identities erased, stored for just such an occasion. Vance's role, 24 years later, was to discover the scene and sell the lie to the world. He hadn't been a mastermind. He was just a pawn. The local, trustworthy face needed to give the fiction credibility. "They have everything, Lena," he finished, his gaze distant, lost in the desert outside his window. "They have forever. You can't win this. Lena left the sheriff's office with the truth. A truth that felt as toxic and heavy as the waste buried deep beneath Solitude Canyon. For a brief, naive moment, she thought the truth was enough. She was wrong. She compiled her evidence, Aris's original damning notes, the Ethelred land contracts, and Sheriff Vance's confession, which she had secretly recorded on her phone, into a single, comprehensive file. She took it to the nearest FBI field office in Las Vegas. The agent who met with her was polite, professional, and listened to her story with a practiced, impenetrable calm. He took her file, promised to look into it, and gave her a case number. She never heard from him again. She went to the press. She contacted a respected investigative journalist at a major national newspaper, a man with a reputation for taking on powerful interests. He was initially intrigued by the story, his reporter's instincts sensing the deep rot beneath the surface. But after 2 weeks of digging, he called her back, his voice strained and clipped. "I'm sorry, Miss Thorne," he said, the words clearly chosen with care. "My sources, very reliable sources, are telling me to drop it. They're saying this Ethelred company is tied up in national security interests going back decades. They're saying the story is a dead end, a very permanent dead end." The invisible wall was everywhere she turned. She sent her file to major environmental protection groups. Her emails went unanswered, her calls unreturned. Her repeated Freedom of Information Act requests were denied, each rejection stamped with the same opaque justification: national security exemption. The system wasn't just failing to find the truth, it was actively, powerfully, and successfully suppressing it. Then came the quieter, more personal pushback. The pushback that was meant just for her. Her library supervisor, a woman she had worked with for 15 years, called her in for a meeting to discuss her erratic behavior and unsubstantiated obsessions. It was a gentle warning, wrapped in the language of corporate concern. A few nights later, she came home to her apartment to find the deadbolt on her door unlocked. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed. But on the center of her large research table, placed neatly on top of her maps of Solitude Canyon, was a single, dead raven. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a piece of grim, theatrical intimidation. It was a message. We see you. We can get to you. Stop. She was fighting a ghost. Ethelred Logistics was more than a company. It was a shadowy arm of the state, protected by decades of secrecy and a legal framework designed to make it untouchable. Sheriff Vance's final words echoed in her mind, no longer a confession, but a prophecy. You can't win. The truth she was discovering with a sickening finality wasn't some Platonic ideal, a force of nature that would inevitably rise to the surface. It was a commodity, and it belonged only to those with the power to shape it. This case would not end with a courtroom confession. It would not end with the satisfying click of handcuffs or the gavel of a judge. It would end, as it began, in silence. The story of Dr. Aris Thorne and the Children of Tellus cult was now cemented in the public record. It was a lurid, fascinating piece of local lore, a story people told to warn their kids about the dangers of the desert and the frightening fragility of the human mind. The lie was now history. The truth was just a whisper only Lena could hear. Aris's core philosophy, the words he had spoken in his last phone call, "The earth keeps no secret," had been horribly, cruelly wrong. Or perhaps it had been incomplete. The Earth might try to speak. It might send up warnings through poisoned water and trembling ground. But human beings, with their vast and powerful machinery of denial and deceit, were masters at silencing it. They could bury their poison so deep and build their lies so high that the planet's slow, honest geological testimony would be drowned out forever. The accidental breakthrough, the drone's footage that had ripped a hole in 24 years of silence, had not led to the truth. It had been co-opted. It had been used as the opening scene for a pre-written play, a fiction designed not to solve a mystery, but to bury the truth even deeper than the bodies in the cavern. This was the ultimate, most painful subversion of the seeker's quest. The unwavering seeker, the keeper of the flame, finds the truth, but the truth is impotent. Justice is not delayed. It is denied by the very systems designed to deliver it. Closure is not a complex process of healing. It is a fiction, a simple story told to comfort the living, while the dead remain dishonored and misunderstood. Lena Thorne now carried the truth of her brother's murder like a radioactive isotope inside her, a terrible, heavy knowledge she could share with no one. She was a library of a single, forbidden book. The world had an answer it could live with, a story that made sense of the senseless. Lena was left with a truth that was unbearable, a truth that proved some monsters are too big to fight. The Earth had not given back what it took. It had been forced to become an accomplice, a silent, poisoned tomb for a man who had only ever wanted to listen to its secrets. Defeated but not destroyed, Lena returned to her library in Denver. The wall of maps was gone. The binders of research, once the altar of her hope, were packed away in neat, anonymous boxes and stored in the basement. Her apartment was once again a quiet, orderly space, a place of books and silence. But the silence was different now. It was not the expectant, humming silence of waiting. It was the heavy, dense silence of knowing. One evening, weeks later, while sorting through the last box of Aris's personal effects, the real ones, the ones she had kept safe for all those years, she found something she'd overlooked. Tucked into a small waterproof pocket in the back of his final field notebook was a piece of folded paper. It was a map, but not a professional survey chart. It was a personal sketch drawn by hand in her brother's familiar, chaotic scrawl. At its center was a rough outline of Solitude Canyon, but radiating out from it, like the spokes of a broken wheel, were lines pointing to 3 other locations across the country. One was in the murky, cypress-choked swamps of Louisiana. Another was deep in the ancient, folded mountains of Appalachia. A third was marked in the vast, frozen tundra of northern Alaska. Each of these locations was marked with a different, small symbol, and beside each symbol, Aris had written a single, chilling word: Chimera. Lena stared at the map, the full, horrifying weight of her brother's final discovery finally settling upon her. He hadn't just found a tomb. He had found a graveyard. Solitude Canyon was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint. Project Chimera, the ghost program she'd read about in the redacted files, had not been a single disposal site. It was a network, a series of secret, festering wounds inflicted upon the country, all hidden in its most remote and forgotten corners. The fight was not over, but it had changed. It would not be a public battle for justice in the light of day. It would be a silent, private war of memory against the forces of forgetting. Her mission was no longer to tell the world what happened to Aris Thorne. That story had been stolen from her. Her new mission was to understand the full scope of what he had found, to follow the last map he had left behind, to bear witness in secret to the other truths the Earth was being forced to keep. She sat in the quiet of her library, the hand-drawn map spread before her like a sacred text, a lone archivist standing against an empire of erasure. The hunt for the truth was over. The duty of remembrance had just begun. The story of Aris Thorne did not end with justice, but with a terrible, quiet clarity. It's a chilling reminder that some secrets are not meant to be found, and that the monsters we should fear most are not the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones who hide behind official seals and walls of silence. What do you think? Can the truth ever truly be buried forever? Or does it always, eventually, find a way to the surface? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Unfound. Our mission here is to uncover the stories that have been lost to time, and to make sure no name stays forgotten. If you believe in that mission, don't forget to subscribe to Unfound and hit the notification bell. We have many more journeys into the dark to take together. Stay safe and never stop seeking the truth.